What if the most important Templar operation did not happen in secret vaults or on distant seas or in whispered rituals beneath stone floors, but in plain sight, after the king had already given the order to destroy them? What if the real mystery is not what the Templars hid before the arrests, but what they quietly moved after the noose was already tightening? Because history tells you that on a single Friday the arrests fell like thunder. But history is strangely quiet about the weeks that followed. Quiet in a way that feels deliberate. Quiet in a way that suggests motion without noise. And tonight, that silence is where we begin. So let the tension soften just a little. Let the imagined clang of prison doors fade into the background. We are not running now. We are listening. Listening for footsteps that were never recorded. Listening for decisions made calmly, patiently, while everyone else believed the story was already over. You are stepping into the final calm before a historical storm, a period that textbooks often glide past with a shrug and a date. Yet this calm is deceptive. It is filled with unanswered letters, delayed officials, half-empty buildings, and ledgers that suddenly stop speaking. You are not here to chase legends of grails or curses or hidden bloodlines. You are here for something quieter and far more unsettling. You are here for the months when an entire military order seems to have obeyed its execution schedule just loosely enough to slip through the cracks. Picture the world of the early 14th century not as a frozen tableau of knights and kings, but as a living network of roads, rivers, ports, inns, monasteries, and messengers. Picture men trained to wait, to calculate, to move only when movement mattered. This is a story about timing rather than treasure, about patience rather than panic. It is also a story about how authority travels slowly while rumor travels fast, especially when it has something to lose. And yes, it is faintly ironic that an order famous for vows of obedience may have perfected the art of not being where they were expected to be. History has a sense of humor like that, and it tends to use it sparingly. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Settle in now. The fire is low, the night is long, and the months everyone ignored are about to speak. The story usually rushes from a royal seal to iron chains, as if authority moved at the speed of thunder. Yet when the orders went out from the French crown, they did not land everywhere at once, and they certainly did not land with equal force. The commands traveled by hand, by horse, by riverboat, and sometimes by men who had other errands to finish first. This is not speculation, but a well-established fact drawn from surviving arrest records which show that while Paris moved swiftly, other regions lingered in a strange administrative twilight. In some towns, the arrests happened within days. In others, weeks passed. In a few places, months quietly slipped by. The silence you felt earlier did not come after the arrests everywhere. In many corners of Europe, it came before them. You can imagine the scene without much effort. A sealed letter arrives at a local court. The seal is impressive, the language severe, and the intent unmistakable. But intent and execution are old acquaintances who rarely arrive together. Officials had to verify orders, consult bishops, gather manpower, and sometimes wait for market day so enough guards would be available. Medieval bureaucracy was many things, but brisk was not one of them. Even the most loyal servants of the crown lived in a world where tomorrow was often negotiable. This gap between command and compliance created something invaluable: time that officially did not exist. Here, the obscure details begin to whisper. In certain dioceses, records show that inquiries were received but not acted upon until additional confirmations arrived. Some clerks dated documents days after they were supposedly enforced, as if unsure which calendar mattered more, the king's or their own. Scholars still debate whether these delays were simple inefficiency or something more deliberate. Were local authorities quietly buying time, or merely trapped in the comfortable habit of hesitation? The paperwork refuses to confess either way, which is precisely what makes it interesting. Think back to the earlier image of empty halls and orderly rooms. That atmosphere does not belong to a sudden collapse. It belongs to something staged with patience. When orders remain in transit, the world behaves as though nothing has changed, even though everything has. The men who received early warnings did not need chaos. They needed calendars. They needed to know how long silence could stretch before it snapped. And they were very good at counting days, which comes with being entrusted with rents, tithes, and obligations that never forgive lateness. There is a persistent scholarly question that hovers here like a candle flame refusing to go out. Did anyone inside the order know with confidence how much time they truly had? Some historians argue that no central estimate could exist because enforcement was too uneven. Others counter that experienced administrators could read the pattern almost instinctively, understanding that the further one moved from the king's direct reach, the looser his grip became. The truth likely sits uncomfortably between those views, which history prefers to do, like a cat choosing the exact center of the doorway to nap. It is worth noting gently and without drama that the crown itself did not fully control the tempo it had unleashed. Once letters were dispatched, the king was reliant on others to act in his name. Those others had farms to run disputes to settle, and in some cases old friendships with the very men they were meant to arrest. None of this proves conspiracy, but it does prove friction. And friction, when applied to time, produces opportunity. There is a quiet irony here that deserves a small smile. A military order trained for sudden action found its greatest advantage in delay, while a powerful monarchy discovered that issuing orders was easier than watching them arrive. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the administrative sighs echoing through stone corridors. Tomorrow, someone says. After Sunday, says another. History is shaped by such phrases more often than by swords. As you settle into this realization, remember the earlier question about movement without noise. Movement does not always mean marching. Sometimes it means waiting while others hesitate. Sometimes it means understanding that the clock everyone trusts is not the only one ticking. In the open space between instruction and obedience, the world briefly forgets to look closely. And that forgetfulness, more than any secret tunnel or hidden fleet, may have been the first door left ajar. Before anything could be moved, hidden, or quietly abandoned, something far simpler had to travel first. News. Not the official kind stamped with wax and authority, but the softer, faster kind that slipped through kitchens, stables, cloisters, and counting rooms. It is a well-established historical reality that medieval Europe possessed no single speed of information, only layers of it. Royal orders crawled, rumors sprinted, and somewhere between them, warnings learned to fly low. A king's command depended on formal channels, on scribes who copied carefully, on messengers who followed prescribed routes, on officials who recognized seals and felt obligated to respond. But unofficial knowledge moved differently. A disgruntled clerk spoke to a cousin. A merchant overheard a conversation at a toll gate. A friar noticed unusual tension in a bishop's household and mentioned it at the next stop. None of this required coordination. It only required curiosity, and curiosity was abundant. If authority marched in a straight line, rumor took shortcuts. Contemporary accounts tell us that long-distance communication by horse could cover impressive ground when urgency demanded it. A determined rider could cross northern France in days, not weeks, especially when he did not need to announce his purpose. Rivers offered even quieter highways. Barges drifted past towns without drawing attention, carrying grain wine, and sometimes men who asked very few questions. The official record struggles to capture these movements because it was never meant to see them. Historians agree on the mechanics of travel, but they debate intention. Did those who spread early warnings know what they were doing, or were they simply repeating unsettling gossip that happened to be accurate? There is an obscure but telling detail buried in correspondence from the period. In several regions, local officials later claimed to be taken by surprise even when arrests occurred suspiciously late. This phrasing appears again and again, like a rehearsed line delivered with a straight face. Some scholars interpret it as bureaucratic self-protection, a way to avoid blame. Others suggest it reveals something stranger, that information reached communities in fragments enough to raise alarm, but not enough to justify action. Imagine hearing that something terrible is coming, but not knowing when, where, or how severe it will be. You do not flee immediately. You prepare quietly. You wait for confirmation. And while you wait, you listen harder. Recall the earlier image of orders suspended in transit of time stretching thin between intention and enforcement. News filled that stretch. It filled it unevenly, unpredictably, like fog rolling through valleys while hilltops remain clear. In some places, the warning was sharp and specific. In others, it was vague, almost mythic, a sense that something was wrong in Paris, and that wrongness was spreading. The fact that reactions varied so widely suggests not chaos, but selective clarity. There is an ongoing scholarly argument that refuses to settle comfortably. Could members of a disciplined order bound by routine and obedience have recognized which information mattered most amid the noise? Skeptics argue that too much rumor dilutes urgency. Supporters counter that experience sharpens perception. Men accustomed to reading financial fluctuations and political moods may have recognized danger not from explicit orders, but from the sudden change in tone. Silence from familiar allies, tension in letters that usually flowed freely, delays where there had once been reliability. The absence of reassurance can speak louder than any proclamation. A moment of gentle humor slips in here because history allows it. Imagine a medieval equivalent of checking your phone and noticing that someone who always replies instantly has suddenly gone quiet. You do not need a royal decree to know something is off. You simply stop posting where you are. And yes, even in the 14th century, being hard to locate was an art form. What matters most is not that news traveled fast everywhere, but that it traveled fast enough in the right places. The earlier calm hauls and orderly departures suggest anticipation rather than panic. Panic scatters. Anticipation arranges. It packs lightly. It chooses routes. It remembers which doors creak and which ones do not. Information does not need to reach everyone to be effective. It only needs to reach those who know what to do with it. As this realization settles, the mystery narrows slightly. Movement without being seen requires advance notice, even if that notice arrives imperfectly. The warnings did not come with schedules or signatures. They came as pressure in the air, as conversations cut short, as eyes that lingered a moment too long on the road. News in this case did not announce the end. It announced the beginning of something quieter. And once you understand how fast that whisper could travel, the stillness that followed begins to feel less like ignorance and more like restraint. When officials finally arrived at certain commanderies, they expected resistance, confusion, perhaps even desperation. Instead, they found stillness. Doors unlocked, fires cold, beds neatly made as if their occupants had stepped out for evening prayer and simply never returned. This is not poetic exaggeration. Surviving inventories describe properties that appeared paused rather than abandoned, their contents present, but their people absent. It is one of the most unsettling facts in the record, because chaos leaves fingerprints, and this did not. In several regions, arrest reports list buildings seized without incident, a phrase that sounds reassuring until you realize how strange it is. A military order trained for discipline does not evaporate overnight by accident. The earlier delays in enforcement had created a cushion of time, and the quiet spread of warning had filled that cushion with intention. These houses did not empty in a rush. They dimmed, one light at a time, one voice removed from the evening meal, one horse no longer in the stable by morning. An obscure detail buried in local accounts hints at preparation rather than flight. In some commanderies, livestock was left behind, while portable items were selectively removed. Grain stores remained full. Tools stayed on walls. But account books, personal effects, and certain ceremonial objects were gone. Scholars argue over what this pattern means. One interpretation suggests panic, a hurried grab of what felt important. Another, more unsettling view proposes prioritization. If panic ruled, why leave behind items that could be sold? Why take documents that would incriminate rather than enrich? The question lingers because the behavior does not fit fear. It fits foresight. Think back to the earlier notion of information arriving unevenly. In places where warnings were clearer, houses emptied earlier. In places where news was murkier, departures were partial or delayed. This unevenness mirrors the delays in enforcement almost too perfectly to ignore. It suggests not a single order shouted across Europe, but a shared understanding shaped locally. Each house reading the situation, measuring risk, deciding how dark to let the night become. There is a scholarly debate that circles this moment like a moth around a lamp. Did these departures require centralized coordination, or could they emerge organically from shared training and expectation? Those who favor decentralization argue that members of the order did not need instructions. They understood how authority worked, how long it took to arrive, and when absence would attract less suspicion than defiance. Others insist that the consistency of the pattern points to guidance, perhaps subtle, perhaps verbal, passed through trusted channels we have yet to fully identify. The documents annoyingly refuse to settle the argument. They only show the result, emptiness, where people should have been. A small, dry humor emerges if you allow it. Medieval officials expecting drama instead found the administrative equivalent of a closed shop, with a polite sign that reads, "Back soon." Except, of course, no one ever came back. It is the kind of anticlimax that history specializes in. The louder the accusation, the quieter the disappearance. Sensory details help anchor this moment. Imagine walking into a stone hall where the air still smells faintly of smoke and bread. The silence is not old. It is fresh. Footprints have not yet been erased. Somewhere nearby, a door creaks in the wind, sounding almost accusatory. This is not the aftermath of violence. It is the residue of choice. Someone decided when to leave. Someone decided how much to take. Someone decided that absence was safer than explanation. Recall the earlier observation that anticipation arranges while panic scatters. These darkened houses feel arranged. They feel like conclusions reached after discussion, after nights spent listening to distant rumors and watching the calendar inch forward. The order did not need to outrun authority. It only needed to step aside while authority tripped over its own process. There remains an open question that keeps historians awake more than they admit. Why did some houses remain occupied longer than others, even when danger was clear? Was it loyalty to local communities, disbelief that the storm would truly break, or a calculated decision to maintain appearances until the last possible moment? The record offers no confession, only timing. And timing, as we have already learned, is the quiet language of this story. As the lights went out across certain regions, they did not do so dramatically. No alarms rang. No banners fell. The darkness spread politely, almost apologetically, as if not to draw attention. And in that gentle dimming, something crucial happened. Authority arrived to find places instead of people, walls instead of witnesses. The night did not hide them. The night simply noticed that they were already gone. The arrest records are meticulous about property. They list buildings, fields, vineyards, mills, and livestock with a care that suggests real enthusiasm for inventory. They are far less enthusiastic about people. This imbalance is not accidental, and it is one of the clearest, most uncomfortable facts in the surviving documentation. In numerous regions, officials carefully recorded what they seized, then used vague language when describing whom they captured. Phrases like certain brothers or those present appear where names should have been. The absence is telling. Historians agree that many members of the order were never arrested at all. That is the established fact. What remains unsettled is how many, and more importantly, why their absence raised so few immediate alarms. One might expect empty dormitories to trigger suspicion, yet in many cases officials proceeded as though partial arrests were sufficient. The paperwork closes itself with a sense of completion that feels oddly premature. It is as if counting walls mattered more than counting men. An obscure detail emerges when you compare arrest lists across neighboring territories. Names appear in one region and then vanish entirely in the next, without explanation. Some brothers seem to dissolve mid-route, never reaching the prisons they were supposedly assigned to. Scholars debate whether this reflects clerical error, lost records, or something more deliberate. Medieval bureaucracy was famously messy, but it was not usually this forgetful about prisoners tied to a major royal initiative. The gaps feel patterned rather than random. Remember the earlier image of darkened houses and selective departures. Those choices now echo here in ink and omission. Men who left early would not appear on arrest lists. Men who left later might be counted once, then never again. And men who stayed too long could vanish between capture and confinement, especially when transport depended on local guards with limited oversight. The story of movement continues, but now it unfolds in documents that seem to look away at crucial moments. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether local officials were complicit, negligent, or simply overwhelmed. Some argue that sympathy played a role. Many members of the order had long-standing relationships with communities they served, providing loans, protection, and mediation. Arresting a building is easy. Arresting a neighbor is not. Others suggest a more pragmatic explanation. Guards were few, prisons were full, and moving captives was costly. If a man was not immediately available, the system quietly adapted. It checked the box and moved on. A light moment slips in because history can be unintentionally funny. Imagine an auditor proudly declaring success while half the staff has already gone on holiday. The books balance, the rooms are secured, and yet the workforce is mysteriously absent. No one wants to ask too many questions, especially when asking would create more work. Sensory imagination helps here again. Picture a clerk hunched over parchment late at night, candle guttering, eager to finish a long list. The buildings are accounted for. The seals are pressed. The names, well, some were there. Others were not. The candle is low. Tomorrow will be busy. Ambiguity becomes a convenience. This ambiguity fuels one of the most persistent questions surrounding these months. Did the order intentionally disperse its members, knowing that decentralized individuals would be harder to track than a centralized body? Or did the dispersion happen organically, driven by personal judgment? Once warnings spread, the records refuse to clarify. They offer results without motivations, outcomes without explanations. For historians, this is both frustrating and revealing. Recall how news traveled faster than authority. That imbalance does not just explain early departures. It explains why absences went unchallenged. By the time officials noticed missing men, their attention had already shifted to managing seized assets and responding to political pressure. The story they were telling themselves was about control and confiscation, not pursuit. In that narrative, people became secondary characters. There is a subtle but important point that often goes unnoticed. The order did not need every member to vanish for the operation to succeed. It needed enough to disappear that continuity could be preserved elsewhere. The remaining arrests served as proof of obedience to royal will, a visible performance of justice. Meanwhile, the invisible majority simply failed to be where the paperwork expected them to be. As you sit with this, the earlier silence takes on a new texture. It is not empty. It is populated by men whose names flicker briefly in documents and then fade. They were not hiding in shadows. They were hiding in gaps. And those gaps, once created, proved remarkably comfortable places to remain unseen. Ports were supposed to remember everything. They recorded arrivals, departures, cargoes, tolls, and disputes with a diligence born of taxation. Salt, wool, wine, timber, pilgrims, soldiers all passed through ledgers that rarely slept. This makes the silences of certain harbors during the critical months especially unsettling. The established fact is simple enough: port records exist for the period, and they show activity continuing almost normally. What they do not show in several key places is anything unusual at all. No surge, no panic, no notable departures that might explain missing men. The absence of evidence is not proof, of course, but it is a very specific kind of absence. The obscure detail emerges when you look closer at how these records were kept. Not everything that sailed was written down with equal enthusiasm. Ships leaving under routine pretexts could pass with minimal notation, especially if their cargo fell within expected categories. A vessel listed as carrying grain or pilgrims could also carry people who did not wish to be named. Scholars argue about whether this represents deliberate concealment or structural blindness. Either way, the result is the same movement that leaves no clear trace. Think back to the earlier discussion of warnings traveling faster than authority. If a man knew he should not be found in his usual place, a port offered both opportunity and anonymity. Ports were busy, loud, and constantly changing. They were also places where strangers were ordinary. A brother who blended into the flow of merchants or sailors would not stand out, especially if he did not insist on being recognized. And why would he? Medieval paperwork, like modern forms, rewarded those who kept their heads down. There is a lively scholarly debate over maritime involvement during these months. Some historians argue that large-scale sea departures would have been impossible to hide, pointing to customs duties and harbor masters. Others counter that the scale did not need to be large. A few men at a time spread across multiple ports would leave no dramatic spike. The question then becomes whether such dispersion was intentional. Did the order avoid concentration precisely to avoid notice? Or was this simply the path of least resistance once land routes felt uncertain? A small irony floats to the surface here. The sea, often imagined as dangerous and unpredictable, may have been safer than the road. Roads had checkpoints, tolls, and familiar faces. Rivers and coastal routes, by contrast, allowed quiet passage under the guise of commerce. A man on a boat was not suspicious. He was practical. Even today, no one blinks when you say you are just passing through, which suggests some things never change. Sensory imagination adds texture again. Picture a dawn harbor, gulls crying, ropes creaking, the smell of salt and fish in the air. Sailors load sacks while merchants argue softly. Somewhere among them stands a man who once slept in a stone dormitory and rose to the sound of bells. Now he wears a traveler's cloak. He does not look back. There is nothing to see. The ledger will note the cargo. It will not note the choice. Recall the earlier mention of empty houses left orderly. Those places did not point toward chaos on the road. They pointed toward controlled exits. Ports fit that pattern. They offered scheduled movement, shared risk, and plausible explanations. The fact that records remain unhelpfully calm suggests that whatever happened did not disrupt normal operations. That alone is remarkable, given the scale of attention focused elsewhere. There is an open question that refuses to settle. Were some port officials aware of who they were helping? Sympathy may have played a role, but so might indifference. Money changes hands in ports constantly. If a fee was paid and no trouble followed, curiosity would not linger. The surviving documents do not confess motive. They simply keep quiet, which is perhaps their most honest feature. A light moment slips in again because even heavy history benefits from it. Imagine the harbor master who prided himself on tidy books, never realizing that his neat columns hid a remarkable human drama. His records would later be praised for their completeness, even as historians scratch their heads and wonder what exactly completeness means. As this realization settles, the broader pattern sharpens. Movement did not announce itself. It disguised itself as routine. Ports that logged nothing extraordinary may have done so because nothing extraordinary appeared to be happening. The men who left did not look like fugitives. They looked like travelers, and in a world accustomed to movement, that was the safest disguise of all. Long before arrests turned into routines, the order relied on messengers whose value lay not in speed alone, but in discretion. It is a well-established fact that internal couriers carried financial instructions, legal notices, and sensitive correspondence between houses, often bypassing local scrutiny by presenting themselves as clerics or merchants. Their roots were familiar, their faces known, and their presence unremarkable. When tension crept into the air, these men did not need new instructions to recognize a change in tone. They had spent years reading between lines written in careful ink. What makes this moment especially intriguing is an obscure pattern in surviving letters. Some communications from the months in question are frustratingly vague, filled with polite phrases and spiritual language that seems at first glance routine. Yet certain formulations appear more frequently during this period, phrases about preparation, prudence, and restraint that scholars argue could double as coded advice. No explicit warning survives no dramatic call to flee. Instead, there is an increase in ambiguity, as though writers suddenly preferred implication over clarity. This has fueled a quiet debate over whether the language itself was the message. Recall how news traveled faster than authority and how houses went dark without noise. Couriers sit neatly between those realities. They were not rumor mongers, and they were not official heralds. They were trusted intermediaries accustomed to carrying meaning without spectacle. A man delivering routine correspondence could also deliver a look, a pause, a lowered voice. Medieval communication was as much about presence as parchment. When someone you trust says very little, you listen harder. There is a scholarly disagreement here that remains unresolved. Some historians argue that any suggestion of coded evacuation orders projects modern conspiracy thinking onto medieval habits. They insist that the language reflects anxiety, not strategy. Others counter that organizations trained in secrecy develop subtle signaling precisely to avoid explicit records. The lack of direct evidence, they argue, is not a weakness of the theory, but its strongest support. Silence, once again, becomes both the problem and the clue. A small, dry humor slips in if you imagine the courier's dual life. One moment he is counting coins and checking seals. The next he is delivering what amounts to a raised eyebrow that says, "Perhaps do not be here next week." No ink required. No wax broken. Just a shared understanding that the world has shifted slightly to the left. Sensory detail helps here. Picture a road winding through early morning mist hooves muffled by damp earth. A messenger rides without urgency because urgency attracts attention. He stops at a familiar house, shares. Bread speaks of weather and travel. Only later when he leaves does the weight of his visit settle in. Something about his timing felt intentional. Something about his brevity felt heavy. Think back to the earlier image of ports that logged nothing unusual. If couriers encouraged dispersion rather than mass movement, that calm makes sense. Instead of directing men to one destination, they may have advised them simply to be elsewhere. Elsewhere is a wonderfully flexible instruction. It does not require maps. It does not leave traces. It fits neatly with the pattern of men missing in plain sight and buildings left intact. An open question lingers that scholars continue to circle. How many couriers would it take to quietly alert a network spread across Europe? Some argue the number would be impossibly large. Others note that information does not need to reach everyone. It needs to reach decision-makers who then act locally. In this view, a handful of trusted messengers could trigger a cascade of small choices that together produce large effects. The debate persists because both sides can point to plausible logistics. There is another subtle detail worth noting. Couriers themselves rarely appear in arrest records. They existed in a liminal space, neither fully resident nor fully transient. This made them difficult to pin down and easy to overlook. In a story increasingly defined by who was not where they were expected to be, that invisibility feels less like coincidence and more like design. A gentle joke because even messengers deserve one. If you have ever received an email that simply says, "Let's talk," you know the power of minimalism. Medieval couriers mastered that art centuries before subject lines existed. Less said, more understood. As the idea settles, the broader pattern sharpens again. Movement without being seen did not require dramatic signals. It required trust. It required people who could carry unease as easily as letters, and who knew when to say nothing at all. The couriers did not shout warnings from rooftops. They whispered them at doorways, and sometimes they did not even whisper. They just arrived, stayed briefly, and left a silence behind them that felt suddenly very loud. If authority were a single unified force, the arrests would have rolled across Europe like a cleanly drawn line. They did not. Instead, they arrived in fits and starts early in some places, embarrassingly late in others. This unevenness is a documented fact, preserved in court registers, that reveal a patchwork of timing. While some regions acted swiftly, others delayed with a patience that feels almost intentional. The question is not whether this happened, but why it happened so differently, depending on where you stood. Part of the explanation lies in the tangled relationship between secular power and ecclesiastical authority. In some territories, bishops hesitated to act without explicit papal confirmation. In others, local rulers weighed the political cost of moving too fast against the risk of appearing disloyal. Medieval governance thrived on consultation, and consultation thrived on delay. A letter sent for advice could take weeks to return, and in that waiting, nothing officially happened. Unofficially, however, everything could change. An obscure but revealing detail appears in correspondence between regional officials and the crown. Some letters express concern not about guilt, but about procedure. They worry about jurisdiction, about who has the right to arrest whom, about whether monasteries fall under one authority or another. These are not excuses invented after the fact. They are genuine anxieties written in real time. Scholars debate whether such concerns were sincere or conveniently slow. Was this legal caution, or was it a way to keep doors open just a little longer? Recall the earlier image of warnings spreading ahead of enforcement and houses quietly dimming their lights. Regions that arrested late were often the same ones where those departures appeared most complete. This correlation is difficult to ignore. It suggests that delay was not merely administrative, but consequential. Time did not sit idle. It was used, and it was used differently depending on how much of it was available. There is a persistent scholarly argument about whether certain local authorities deliberately stalled to protect assets or people. Some historians argue that sympathy played a role, pointing to long-standing relationships and mutual dependence. Others caution against romanticizing hesitation, noting that medieval officials were perfectly capable of indecision without moral intent. The debate remains unresolved because motives are rarely recorded with honesty. What we have instead are outcomes, and the outcomes speak softly but clearly. A light moment surfaces if you imagine the rhythm of medieval meetings. Councils convene, arguments, circle candles burn low, and someone inevitably says, "We should consult another party." Everyone nods relieved. Nothing feels safer than postponement dressed up as prudence. Even today, committees everywhere salute this ancient tradition. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture a stone chamber where voices echo slightly too much, making everyone speak slower. Outside, the seasons shift. Roads dry or turn to mud. Inside, decisions age like cheese, acquiring complexity while doing very little. Meanwhile, men who understand the value of calendars quietly adjust their plans. Think back to the ports that logged nothing unusual. Late arrests meant that departures could blend into normal traffic, rather than stand out as sudden flight. A man leaving before arrests looks like a traveler. A man leaving after arrests looks like a fugitive. Timing transforms appearance, and appearance shapes response. Regions that delayed inadvertently provided camouflage. An open question lingers that scholars still wrestle with. Did the crown underestimate how uneven its control truly was? Some argue that royal authority was assumed to be stronger than it actually was, especially outside core territories. Others suggest that the king accepted uneven enforcement as long as the symbolic center held. After all, high-profile arrests in major cities sent a powerful message, even if the edges frayed quietly. There is another subtle pattern worth noticing. Regions that arrested late often reported fewer conflicts and less resistance. This calm has been interpreted as compliance, but it may also reflect absence. If fewer men remained to arrest, fewer problems would arise. Silence once again proves adaptable. It can signal peace just as easily as it can hide departure. A gentle joke fits here because even royal authority deserves one. Issuing an order and assuming it will be obeyed instantly is a bit like sending a group message and expecting everyone to reply at once. Some people respond immediately, others read it later. A few never reply at all, yet somehow still change their behavior. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern tightens. Late arrests were not random glitches. They were part of an environment where authority moved at human speed, burdened by caution, pride, and paperwork. Those who needed time found it in abundance, provided they knew where to look. And those who expected uniform obedience discovered that power, like news, travels unevenly. The months when movement went unseen were shaped as much by hesitation as by action. Every delayed arrest widened the window just a little more. Every unanswered letter added another day. And in that widening space, the quiet work of disappearance continued, unremarkable to those watching the clock, but invaluable to those watching the road. If men can disappear quietly, money should be far harder to lose track of. Coins clink. Ledgers balance, or they do not. Debts demand memory. And yet one of the most stubborn facts surrounding these months is that expected wealth was simply not where it was supposed to be. Royal officials anticipated treasuries swollen with silver chests, heavy with coin accounts ripe for seizure. Instead, they found balances that felt oddly incomplete. This is not rumor. Contemporary complaints survive expressing surprise that the financial windfall never quite materialized. The established fact is that the order managed an extensive financial network, acting as bankers, landlords, and custodians of deposits. Their accounting systems were sophisticated for their time, designed to track obligations across long distances. What unsettles historians is not that money moved, but that its movement left so little trace. In some regions, account books stop abruptly, as if the story simply lost interest in continuing. In others, balances appear to have been transferred shortly before arrests, but without clear destinations. Scholars argue fiercely over interpretation. Was this routine financial housekeeping accelerated by fear or evidence of deliberate evacuation? An obscure but telling detail appears in later audits. Some seized properties continued to generate income, yet the initial inventories underestimated their value. Rents were lower than expected. Debts owed to the order proved difficult to collect. It is as if the financial skeleton remained, but the muscle had been quietly removed. One interpretation suggests that obligations were reassigned informally, perhaps even verbally, to trusted hands outside official channels. Another insists that losses were exaggerated by officials embarrassed at failing to secure the expected prize. The debate persists because numbers can lie politely when no one forces them to speak plainly. Recall the earlier image of houses left intact but selectively emptied. The pattern fits. Heavy furniture stayed. Grain remained. What moved were things that could travel discreetly: coin, documents, promises. Money does not always need to be carried physically. A word spoken to the right person can redirect value just as effectively as a wagon. Medieval finance relied on trust networks that rarely appear in dramatic narratives, but they were very real, and they were very quiet. There is an ongoing scholarly question that refuses to settle comfortably. Did the order centralize its remaining assets somewhere beyond reach, or did it deliberately fragment them to avoid detection? Centralization risks discovery. Fragmentation risks loss. The choice between them reveals intent. Some historians argue that fragmentation makes more sense given the lack of any later discovery of a grand hidden treasury. Others counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when secrecy is the goal. The silence of the record remains stubborn. A small, dry humor slips in here. Imagine the frustration of officials who arrived expecting a fortune and instead found receipts, promises, and explanations. It is the medieval equivalent of opening a long-anticipated package and finding the manual inside, but not the device. Everything technically checks out, and yet something feels missing. Sensory detail grounds this again. Picture a chest opened in a stone room, hinges groaning, only to reveal far less than expected. The air holds that awkward pause when disappointment registers. Someone clears a throat. A clerk writes carefully, choosing words that soften reality. The treasure did not vanish dramatically. It thinned. Think back to the ports that logged nothing unusual, and the couriers who spoke in implication. Money that moves quietly leaves fewer ripples than men who run. Financial adjustments could occur over weeks disguised as routine transfers, forgiven debts, or delayed payments. By the time authority arrived with its seals and lists, the arithmetic had already changed. There is also the uncomfortable question of complicity. Did outsiders help shield these assets knowingly or not? Merchants, nobles, and institutions had long interacted with the order financially. Untangling those relationships under pressure would have been slow and politically costly. Some historians suggest that rather than pull too hard, officials accepted partial answers. After all, pursuing every missing coin would mean questioning too many powerful people. A gentle joke belongs here because finance always earns one. If you have ever tried to audit a complicated system after it has been simplified, you know the feeling. Everything appears neat, and yet the totals never quite add up. Somewhere a column has slipped sideways. As this realization settles, the broader pattern tightens again. Time-warning discretion and delay did not just move people. They moved value. And value once redistributed quietly becomes remarkably hard to reclaim. The missing money is not just a financial mystery. It is evidence of planning measured in weeks rather than moments. The months when movement went unseen were also months when wealth learned to travel lightly. Not in wagons that creaked, but in obligations that changed hands, in promises that followed men rather than buildings. When authority finally took stock, it found itself rich in property and poor in answers. And once again, the silence where noise was expected speaks louder than any confession. When authority finally crossed certain thresholds, it braced for disorder. Instead, it encountered rooms that looked rehearsed. Strongholds associated with the order stood open and calm, their contents aligned, as if the occupants expected guests rather than jailers. This is an established fact, recorded in inventories that describe furnishings, undisturbed altars, maintained storerooms orderly, not looted, not barricaded, simply present. The surprise was not what officials found, but what they did not. Castles are not tents. They are statements. They take time to abandon poorly and even more time to abandon well. And yet the reports speak of intact defenses and functioning infrastructure without corresponding populations. The obvious explanation would be sudden flight, but sudden flight leaves scars, broken locks, scattered tools, half-finished meals. What appears instead is something closer to choreography. Lamps extinguished, keys accounted for. The impression is of departure that respected the building rather than fled from it. An obscure detail deepens the unease. In a handful of places, maintenance records continue briefly after the supposed evacuations, noting repairs to roofs or walls. Scholars debate what this means. One interpretation suggests caretakers remained behind, perhaps lay workers or affiliates, tasked with preserving assets until ownership transferred. Another proposes that such entries were retroactive, added to create an appearance of continuity. The controversy persists because the handwriting looks genuine, but the timing feels off. Why maintain a place you no longer intend to inhabit unless the place itself still matters? Recall the earlier pattern of money thinning quietly and houses dimming rather than collapsing. These intact fortifications fit the same logic. Destruction would draw attention. Disorder would invite questions. Preservation, by contrast, encourages assumptions of normalcy. If a castle looks ready for use, observers assume it is merely between occupants. Silence does the rest. Authority tends to trust appearances that save effort. There is a scholarly question that remains stubbornly open. Were these sites intentionally preserved for potential future use, or were they simply too valuable to damage during a controlled exit? Some historians argue that maintaining castles suggests hope of return or transfer to friendly hands. Others insist it reflects prudence. Buildings attract scrutiny when they fall into ruin, while intact ones blend into administrative routines. The records do not declare motive. They only show care where neglect would have been easier. A small humor slips in here, because even stone walls deserve one. If you have ever tidied your home knowing someone else will soon take over, you understand the impulse. You straighten things not out of affection for the visitor, but because chaos would feel like a confession. Medieval stone, it seems, inspired the same instinct. Sensory imagination grounds the moment. Picture a courtyard where the echo of footsteps sounds louder because no one answers them. The flagstones are swept. The well bucket hangs neatly. Somewhere a hinge squeaks, annoyed at the intrusion. This is not abandonment born of fear. It is departure born of confidence. The building has been left in a state that suggests it can wait. Think back to ports that logged nothing unusual and couriers who spoke in implication. A preserved stronghold complements that strategy. It tells a story that requires no explanation. Officials can seize it, inventory it, and move on. They do not feel compelled to ask where everyone went, because the environment does not demand that question. Calm rooms lull curiosity. There is another obscure detail that invites debate. In certain castles, ceremonial items remained, while personal ones vanished. Banners associated with the institution stayed, while individual insignia did not. Some scholars read this as symbolic, a quiet separation of personal identity from institutional shell. Others warn against overinterpretation, suggesting practical considerations drove choices. Still, the pattern recurs often enough to keep the argument alive. When patterns repeat, historians lean forward. A gentle joke earns its place. Officials expecting dramatic resistance instead found excellent housekeeping. One imagines a moment of disappointment followed by relief. No fires to put out. No walls to breach. Bureaucracy prefers neatness even when it masks absence. The intact castles also raise an uncomfortable question about priorities. Why preserve stone while people vanish? The answer may lie in the earlier realization that property was easier to control than men. Buildings could be seized, repurposed, reassigned. People required pursuit. By leaving fortifications ready for transfer, the order may have reduced the incentive to chase what was missing. Authority satisfied with tangible assets accepted the exchange. There is a modern aside that fits quietly. Empty offices that remain furnished often signal not closure, but transition. The lights are off, but the lease continues. The assumption of continuity buys time. It always has. Medieval observers were no different. They read cues and moved on when cues suggested stability. As the pattern sharpens, the intact castles become more than curiosities. They are props in a larger performance of normalcy. They absorb attention that might otherwise turn toward roads and rivers. They suggest completion when the story is still unfolding, and in that suggestion movement remains unseen. The months when the order moved quietly were not months of scorched earth. They were months of careful preservation. Stone walls stood as alibis, whispering that nothing urgent had happened here. Meanwhile, the urgency had already gone elsewhere, traveling lightly, leaving behind rooms that looked ready for tomorrow. And tomorrow, as officials would learn too late, was already spoken for. At some point, the pattern begins to feel too coherent to dismiss as coincidence. Delays align with departures. Departures align with missing men. Missing men align with thinned finances and intact strongholds. This is where the uncomfortable question finally steps forward and refuses to leave. Was anyone directing this? The established fact is that the order possessed a hierarchical structure with regional leadership capable of coordinating resources and policy. What remains unresolved is whether that structure was still functioning in these months, or whether it dissolved into local improvisation. The historical record offers no surviving document that says plainly, "Leave now." That absence has divided scholars for decades. Some argue that without written proof, coordination on a continental scale is implausible. Others counter that written proof is precisely what a disciplined organization would avoid creating under threat. Medieval institutions understood the danger of incriminating paperwork long before modern intelligence agencies put shredders in their offices. Silence once again complicates certainty. An obscure but revealing detail surfaces in the behavior of regional leaders during interrogations. When questioned, many insisted they acted independently, guided only by conscience or circumstance. Yet their testimonies share a curious similarity in tone and framing. They emphasize obedience, ignorance, and personal limitation in ways that feel rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Scholars debate whether this reflects shared truth or shared training. Were they genuinely cut off from direction, or were they performing the safest version of the story they all knew to tell? Recall the earlier image of couriers who carried meaning without spectacle. If guidance existed, it did not need to be explicit. A nod, a pause, a change in routine. Central command does not always issue commands. Sometimes it adjusts expectations and lets experienced members fill in the details. This method leaves no paper trail and produces outcomes that look organic while remaining aligned. It is efficient, deniable, and very difficult to prove after the fact. There is an ongoing scholarly argument about whether such subtle coordination could hold across borders. Skeptics point to the diversity of responses as evidence against central direction. Supporters argue the opposite, noting that flexibility itself can be a feature of coordination. Uniform behavior attracts attention. Varied behavior confuses it. The fact that movements differed in timing and method may not undermine the idea of guidance. It may support it. A light moment fits here because the idea of leadership without orders feels familiar. Anyone who has worked under a manager who just wants you to use your judgment understands how powerful that phrase can be. No instruction is given, yet everyone somehow knows what is expected. Medieval command structures were no strangers to this dynamic. Authority could be asserted through expectation rather than decree. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture a gathering where very little is said. Eyes meet. Someone clears a throat. A decision settles without being voiced. When people who share long experience read the same signals, coordination can happen in near silence. The absence of noise is not proof of absence of control. It may be evidence of mastery. Think back to the intact castles and selective removal of personal items. Such consistency suggests shared priorities. Individual houses could decide when to leave, but what they took and what they left behind follows a recognizable logic. Documents, personal seals, and portable value move. Institutional shells remain. This division hints at an understanding that transcended local panic. Someone somewhere understood what mattered most. There is also the question of timing. The peak of unseen movement appears clustered within a narrow window, as later analysis will show. Random reactions tend to scatter over longer periods. Coordinated responses compress time. Scholars continue to argue over whether this clustering is real or an artifact of incomplete records. Yet even incomplete records, when aligned across regions, tell a story that feels synchronized enough to raise eyebrows. A gentle joke deserves its place. If coordination existed, it was the quietest management meeting in history. No minutes taken, no agenda circulated, just a shared sense that it was time to stop being present. Many modern organizations would envy that level of efficiency. The question of central command remains unresolved because it sits at the intersection of intention and evidence. Those who demand explicit proof will never be satisfied. Those who read patterns will always see direction. The truth may lie between. Guidance could have existed without rigidity, leadership without micromanagement. In such a model, the center sets the tone and the edges improvise within it. As you hold this uncertainty, the earlier silence deepens. It is not empty. It is structured. It has shape. Whether that shape was drawn by one hand or many remains the great puzzle. But the outcome is undeniable. Across distances and jurisdictions, behavior converged just enough to matter. The months when movement went unseen may not have required a master plan pinned to a wall. They may have required something subtler: shared training, shared expectation, and shared patience. Central command in this sense would not be a voice shouting orders, but a presence that no longer needed to speak. And when that presence withdrew, it left behind a coordinated absence that history still struggles to explain. When the interrogations began in earnest, something curious happened. Voices filled the chambers. Confessions poured out under pressure, repetition, and exhaustion. Accusations multiplied. Yet amid all this noise, one subject remained conspicuously untouched. No one spoke about preparation. No one admitted to planning escape. No one described meetings about departure routes or timing. This silence is not imagined. It is an established fact that surviving confessions, detailed as they often are, do not mention coordinated withdrawal or advance warning. For historians, this absence is as striking as any testimony. At first glance, the explanation seems obvious. Men under threat say what they must to survive. They avoid introducing new accusations that could worsen their situation. Yet the silence persists, even where honesty might have reduced suffering. Some confessions wander into the mundane, admitting to minor infractions or misunderstandings that carry little consequence. Still, when it comes to the question of leaving early, of being absent at the critical moment, mouths close. The topic appears to have been mutually agreed upon as off-limits, even when agreement itself was never discussed. An obscure detail deepens the puzzle. In several recorded interrogations, questioners appear to circle close to the issue without quite naming it. They ask about obedience, about knowledge of rumors, about loyalty to superiors. And yet they never press directly on whether brothers were warned in advance to remove themselves. Scholars argue over whether this reflects oversight or intention. Did interrogators simply fail to imagine that disappearance could be strategic? Or did they suspect something and choose not to articulate it? Perhaps because articulating it would complicate their narrative of surprise and control. Recall the earlier idea of central guidance without explicit orders. Silence fits neatly within that framework. If nothing was written down, nothing could be confessed. If nothing was spoken plainly, nothing could be repeated under pressure. Training emphasizes not only what to say, but what never to say. In that sense, silence becomes a discipline. It is practiced long before it is needed. there is an ongoing scholarly debate that refuses to settle comfortably. Some historians argue that the silence proves there was no plan worth mentioning. According to this view, men left individually guided by instinct rather than instruction. Others counter that silence across hundreds of testimonies is itself evidence of shared understanding. Random behavior produces random confession. Consistent omission suggests something learned and reinforced. The truth predictably hovers between interpretation and intuition. A light moment fits here because even silence has its humor. Imagine a room full of people all deciding independently to avoid the same topic, never discussing that decision, yet executing it flawlessly. Anyone who has sat through a family dinner knows this is not only possible, but remarkably common. Medieval brotherhoods were no less skilled at collective avoidance. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture an interrogation chamber heavy with incense and sweat. A question is asked. The answer wanders. Another question follows. The candle burns lower. Everyone knows there is something else that could be said, but no one reaches for it. The silence is not empty. It is crowded with restraint. Think back to the intact castles and missing men. Officials encountered absence everywhere, yet did not extract explanations for it. Silence protected both sides. The accused avoided further suspicion. The interrogators avoided confronting how thoroughly the situation had slipped their grasp. Acknowledging preparation would mean admitting failure, and institutions rarely enjoy that kind of honesty. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that silence was encouraged implicitly by interrogators themselves. If no one mentions organized departure, the narrative remains manageable. The story stays focused on guilt rather than logistics. Scholars debate whether this reflects conscious avoidance or simple tunnel vision. When you believe you have already won, you stop asking questions that could suggest otherwise. A gentle joke earns its place. Silence, after all, is the oldest legal strategy in history. It predates lawyers, law schools, and even written law. Say nothing has always been remarkably effective advice. Another obscure detail invites scrutiny. In some later proceedings, officials refer vaguely to suspects who could not be found without expressing outrage or urgency. The phrasing feels resigned rather than alarmed. This tone suggests that absence had become normalized quickly, almost accepted, as an administrative inconvenience rather than a crisis. Silence in this context did not just hide truth, it reshaped expectations. The open question remains tantalizing. Was the silence maintained out of loyalty to a vanished structure, or out of self-preservation once that structure was gone? Did men protect an organization, or did they protect themselves? Scholars continue to argue both sides, and the sources refuse to arbitrate. They simply do not speak. As you sit with this, the broader pattern sharpens again. News traveled quietly. Houses emptied calmly. Money thinned discreetly. Castles stood ready. And when voices were finally demanded, they spoke loudly about many things, but not about that. Silence here is not a gap in the story. It is part of the story's architecture. The months when movement went unseen depended as much on what was not said as on what was done. In a world obsessed with confession and record restraint, proved powerful. Words were offered where they were demanded and withheld where they would have mattered most. And in that disciplined quiet, the invisible work of disappearance remained safely beyond reach. If you wanted to disappear in the medieval world, you did not sprint down the main road with a sack over your shoulder. Roads were loud. They were taxed, watched, measured, and remembered. Inns kept notes. Toll stations collected names. Familiar faces were noticed when they passed too often or too quickly. The established fact is that major roads were among the most documented spaces in medieval Europe, precisely because they were valuable, which makes it telling that the traces we expect to find along them are so thin. Historians know that alternatives existed, and they were used constantly by people who preferred not to be counted. Rivers, forest paths, monastic lanes, and seasonal tracks cut across official routes like quiet stitches. These paths appear only indirectly in records, usually when something goes wrong. Otherwise, they remain invisible. The obscure detail that unsettles researchers is how frequently later references place former members near waterways rather than roads, as if water had become the preferred companion of caution. Recall the earlier observation that ports logged nothing unusual. That calm makes more sense if the approach to those ports avoided the places where attention gathered. A man arriving by river from upstream villages would blend far more easily than one riding in from a fortified road gate. Rivers offered continuity without checkpoints, movement without announcement. They were also predictable in their unpredictability, which made them ideal for those who valued routine disguised as accident. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the order possessed detailed internal knowledge of these alternative routes. Some argue that years of managing estates and supply chains would naturally produce such familiarity. Others insist that the scale of use implied by later patterns suggests something more deliberate, perhaps shared maps or oral knowledge passed between houses. The difficulty lies in proof. Paths that leave no record also leave no confirmation. We are left to infer from destination rather than journey. A light moment fits here, because even secrecy has its preferences. Roads are for people who want to be seen arriving somewhere. Paths are for people who only care about not being seen leaving. The distinction matters, and medieval travelers understood it intuitively. If you have ever taken a side street simply because it feels quieter, you already grasp the logic. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture a narrow track slipping into a stand of trees, leaves damp underfoot, the sound of water somewhere nearby. No banners, no milestones, just movement measured by breath and balance. Such routes reward patience. They also reward those who know when to travel slowly. Speed attracts notice. Steadiness dissolves into landscape. Think back to the missing men in plain sight. Their disappearance did not require dramatic exits. It required choices that placed them beyond the gaze of record keepers. Roads funnel movement into memory. Paths dissolve it. When multiple men choose dissolution at roughly the same time, the effect looks coordinated, even if each decision feels personal. There is another obscure detail worth noting. In some later property disputes, witnesses mention individuals arriving from elsewhere without specifying how. The phrasing suggests movement that did not intersect with recognized routes. Scholars debate whether this vagueness reflects ignorance, indifference, or deliberate imprecision. In a legal culture that prized specificity, such language stands out. It is as if the journey itself was not meant to be discussed. An open question remains stubborn. Did these alternative routes serve merely as temporary corridors? Or did they connect to longer-term refugees beyond the immediate crisis? Some historians argue that forest and river paths only explain short-term evasion. Others suggest they were gateways to new networks linking monasteries, rural estates, and sympathetic households. The truth may depend on region, season, and chance. Movement, after all, is rarely uniform. A gentle joke earns its place. Roads are where history expects you to be. Paths are where history loses interest. Anyone hoping to avoid becoming a footnote would choose accordingly. As this understanding settles, the earlier patterns align again, Delayed arrests created time. Couriers shaped expectation. Silence protected intent. And routes that avoided roads ensured that intent left no echo. The disappearance was not magic. It was geography used intelligently. The months when movement went unseen were not months of frantic escape along highways. They were months of measured travel along margins, edges of forests, bends of rivers, boundaries between jurisdictions where responsibility blurred. In those places, authority thinned memory, softened, and movement became something the landscape itself seemed willing to keep. By choosing where not to go, the order chose where it could pass unnoticed. And in a world that watched its roads closely, the paths did the rest. Disappearance rarely succeeds on movement alone. Sooner or later, motion slows, and slowing requires shelter. This brings us to a fact that is both established and unsettling. Many members did not vanish into wilderness or exile, but reappeared quietly within familiar regions, lodged in places that did not officially belong to the order. Contemporary documents record former brothers living as clerics, laborers, or dependents in households that had long interacted with the institution. They were not fugitives in hiding. They were guests who did not ask to be named. The obscure detail that complicates this picture lies in the nature of medieval hospitality. Monasteries, minor noble estates, and even prosperous towns maintained traditions of lodging travelers without extensive inquiry. Hospitality was not just courtesy, it was obligation. Scholars debate whether these hosts understood whom they were receiving. Some argue that knowledge was explicit and protective. Others suggest plausible deniability, where no one asked questions they did not want answered. In either case, shelter was provided, and shelter transforms movement into disappearance. Recall the earlier pattern of intact castles and missing men. Those castles were shells that absorbed attention while life continued elsewhere. Safe houses functioned as the inverse invisible spaces that absorbed people without drawing notice. When a man ceased to belong visibly to a powerful institution, he became easier to overlook. Authority tends to track affiliations more readily than individuals, and once affiliation dissolved, scrutiny faded with it. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about the scale of this network. Was it extensive, coordinated, and prearranged, or did it grow organically from existing relationships? Some historians argue that years of financial dealings and spiritual patronage created a web of goodwill that could be activated quietly. Others caution against assuming loyalty where convenience might suffice. Offering a room to a traveler costs little and earns social credit. Protection does not always require ideology. Sometimes it requires only habit. A light moment fits here because hospitality has always had loopholes. "He's staying for a while" is a phrase that can stretch indefinitely. Medieval households were adept at accommodating ambiguity. If a guest worked, prayed, or kept to himself, curiosity had a way of fading. Even today, the longest-term residents are often introduced with the vaguest explanations. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a modest estate at dusk, smoke rising gently from a hearth. A man arrives without ceremony, greeted not with surprise but with routine. He eats quietly, sleeps in a side room, rises early. No banners hang. No records are updated. Life continues slightly adjusted, like furniture moved just enough to fit another presence. Think back to the earlier discussion of routes that avoided roads. Those paths did not always lead far away. Sometimes they led just far enough. Safe houses offered proximity without visibility, allowing men to remain within known landscapes while slipping beyond institutional notice. This closeness matters. Exile attracts attention. familiarity dissolves into background noise. There is an uncomfortable question scholars continue to wrestle with. Did these shelters represent loyalty to the order or loyalty to individuals? The distinction matters. Protecting an institution is risky. Protecting a person feels humane. Many hosts may have believed they were doing the latter while inadvertently sustaining the former. Intent once again blurs under pressure. Another obscure detail invites scrutiny. In later decades, records occasionally mention men of uncertain origin entering clerical or administrative roles without clear prior training histories. Scholars debate whether these gaps reflect lost paperwork or quiet transitions from former identities. The evidence is circumstantial, but the timing aligns closely enough to provoke suspicion. When patterns repeat, historians take note even when proof refuses to cooperate. A gentle joke earns its place. If you have ever tried to track a friend who keeps crashing on couches, you know how quickly official addresses lose relevance. Medieval bureaucracy faced the same frustration minus the texting. As this realization settles, the broader pattern sharpens again. Movement slowed not into stillness but into dispersal. Safe houses did not announce rescue. They normalized absence. A man who belonged nowhere officially could belong anywhere quietly. Authority focused on seizing property and extracting confessions, rarely pursued guests who left no paper trail. The months when movement went unseen depended on this quiet generosity of space. Not dramatic refuges, but ordinary rooms. Not fortified sanctuaries, but places where nothing seemed out of place. Shelter completed what travel began. It allowed disappearance to become sustainable. By stepping beyond the boundaries of their own institution, members entered a world where expectations softened. They were no longer knights or officials. They were just people passing through, staying for a time, helping where they could. And in that gentle anonymity, the work of vanishing reached its most effective form. The sea has a reputation for swallowing evidence, and in these months, it may have done so politely rather than violently. The established fact is that maritime traffic continued at a steady rhythm during the period in question, with no dramatic spikes that would suggest panic or mass escape. Yet alongside that normalcy sits a quieter truth. Not every passage required a proclamation, and not every passenger required a name. Coastal movement was constant, seasonal, and often routine. That routine is precisely what makes it useful. An obscure detail emerges when you compare port customs with private shipping practices. Many short-haul vessels operated on informal arrangements, moving between familiar harbors with trusted crews. Their manifests focused on cargo value, not on who slept below deck. Scholars debate whether this informality amounts to concealment or simply reflects the practical limits of medieval record-keeping. Either way, the effect is the same. A person could move by water without becoming memorable, especially if the journey looked ordinary. Recall the earlier calm of ports that logged nothing unusual. That calm does not argue against maritime movement. It argues for it being unremarkable. A handful of men boarding different vessels over several weeks would not register as a pattern to officials expecting a spectacle. Spread thinly enough, departure dissolves into background noise. The sea rewards dispersion. There is a lively scholarly argument over whether certain destinations would have been chosen deliberately. Some point to regions with looser enforcement or sympathetic authorities, arguing that maritime routes offered direct access to safer shores. Others caution that the evidence does not support targeted migration. They suggest instead that movement followed existing commercial routes, not strategic ones. The debate hinges on intention. Did sailors carry passengers because they knew where they were going, or because they did not need to know at all? A light moment fits here because ships are excellent at plausible deniability. "I took on a passenger in the last port" is a statement that invites no follow-up when ports blur together. Even today, ferry rides end with little curiosity about who arrived where. Medieval seas were no different. Water moves everyone forward and asks few questions. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a small vessel pushing off at dawn, hull creaking, oars dipping rhythmically. The shoreline recedes without ceremony. A man sits among sacks of grain, hood drawn low, indistinguishable from any other traveler who prefers not to chat before sunrise. The wind carries him away, and the land forgets him almost immediately. Think back to the role of couriers and the preference for implication over instruction. Maritime movement fits that ethos. No single directive needed to be issued. A suggestion to consider the water would be enough for those who understood the options. Once at sea, choice multiplied. Continue onward, disembark early, transfer to another vessel. Flexibility was the sea's greatest gift. There is an open question that refuses to settle. Did any maritime authorities quietly assist, or did assistance come from indifference rather than sympathy? Some historians argue that sailors accustomed to risk and anonymity cared little for politics ashore. Others suggest that long-standing relationships with the order forged through transport and supply contracts may have softened scrutiny. The record unhelpfully provides no confession. It provides only the steady absence of alarm. Another obscure detail invites attention. In a few coastal regions, legal disputes decades later reference individuals who arrived by ship without further explanation, as if arrival by water required no elaboration. Scholars debate whether this reflects lost memory or deliberate vagueness. Either way, the phrasing underscores how sea travel normalized arrival without origin. A man from the sea was simply present. His past floated somewhere behind him. A gentle joke earns its place. The sea, it seems, has always been the original privacy mode. Once you are on it, your previous tabs close. As this realization settles, the broader pattern tightens again. Roads were watched. Paths dissolved movement. Rivers guided it quietly. Ships completed the picture by offering continuity without accountability. None of these methods required secrecy in the dramatic sense. They required only an understanding of where attention gathers and where it does not. The months when movement went unseen did not hinge on a single grand exodus. They unfolded through many small crossings, each forgettable on its own. By the time authority might have asked where everyone went, the answer would have been unhelpfully true. They went the way travelers always go, by water, by habit, by routes that left the fewest questions behind. In the end, ships that sailed unrecorded did not need to outrun pursuit. They only needed to look like everything else already in motion. And in a world accustomed to the constant comings and goings of the sea, that was enough to let disappearance drift quietly beyond the horizon. When the trials finally took shape, they moved with a strange confidence, as if the most important questions had already been answered. Charges were formalized, testimonies were gathered, procedures hardened into routine. Yet one line of inquiry remained conspicuously absent. No sustained effort was made to reconstruct where people had gone in the weeks before arrests. This is an established fact, visible in the trial records themselves. They are exhaustive about belief ritual and obedience, but remarkably incurious about logistics. At first glance, this seems like oversight, the natural result of an investigation driven by predetermined accusations. But the absence is too consistent to dismiss casually. Questioners asked about heresy with obsessive persistence, circling the same points again and again. They asked about secret rites, oaths, and symbols. What they did not ask, at least not directly, was how so many men had managed to be elsewhere when the knock finally came. The silence around that topic feels intentional, or at least convenient. An obscure detail deepens the puzzle. In a handful of interrogations, witnesses volunteer information about travel, mentioning journeys taken shortly before arrests. These remarks are rarely pursued. The record moves on as if the detail were irrelevant. Scholars debate whether this reflects tunnel vision or strategy. Did investigators genuinely believe theology mattered more than movement? Or did they sense that following the trail of absence would lead somewhere uncomfortable? The documents, frustratingly, do not explain their own priorities. Recall the earlier image of intact castles and thin treasuries. Those outcomes suggest planning. Yet the trials treat absence as incidental, almost embarrassing. The narrative they construct depends on surprise and total control. Asking how people escaped would undermine that narrative. It would suggest that authority had been anticipated, even managed. Institutions are rarely eager to document their own miscalculations, especially when those miscalculations reveal competence on the other side. There is an ongoing scholarly argument about whether the trials were designed to discover truth or to confirm a conclusion. Some historians argue that once guilt was assumed, logistics became irrelevant. Others suggest that logistics were avoided precisely because they might reveal a level of organization that contradicted the image of a corrupt, disordered group. The debate remains unresolved, but the pattern is clear. The questions that might have explained disappearance were never fully asked. A light moment fits here because investigative blind spots are timeless. Anyone who has ever been questioned about one thing while wishing they would ask about another understands the relief of misdirection. The trials pursued the spectacular and ignored the practical, which made them thorough in appearance and shallow in effect. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture a courtroom heavy with expectation. The air smells of wax and old wood. A question is asked, answered, and recorded. Another follows, equally familiar. Outside, the world continues to move, but inside, the narrative tightens into a loop. The missing people remain missing, not because no one noticed, but because noticing would complicate the script. Think back to the silence maintained by those who were questioned. Silence thrives when questions are predictable. If you know what will be asked, you know what to avoid. The trials, by repeating familiar accusations, allowed witnesses to prepare accordingly. What was never demanded never needed to be concealed actively. Absence became safe because it was not interrogated. There is an open question that continues to trouble historians. Did investigators possess informal knowledge about departures that they chose not to formalize? Some argue that rumors circulated within official circles but were deemed unprovable or inconvenient. Others suggest that acknowledging such knowledge would have forced a reassessment of strategy. If men had left in advance, then arrests were incomplete by design. That is not a comfortable conclusion for a crown eager to demonstrate decisiveness. Another obscure detail invites attention. In later summaries of the trials, officials emphasize the completeness of the process, using language that suggests closure. Words like finished and resolved appear even when outcomes remain ambiguous. Scholars debate whether this reflects confidence or fatigue. Investigations are expensive. At some point, institutions prefer an ending to an answer. Silence can be a budgetary decision as much as a political one. A gentle joke earns its place. Trials, like meetings, tend to focus on what fits the agenda. Items that threaten to derail the timetable are quietly skipped. Medieval justice, it seems, ran on the same principle. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern sharpens yet again. Movement went unseen, not only because it was discreet, but because the apparatus meant to reveal it looked elsewhere. Roads, ports, houses, money, and people all left traces. Those traces required curiosity to connect. The trials supplied conviction. Without curiosity, certainty without reconstruction. The months when movement went unseen were protected by more than silence and geography. They were protected by narrative. Once the story was framed around belief rather than behavior, logistics faded into the background. Authority declared victory over ideas while quietly conceding ground in practice. What the trials never asked matters as much as what they recorded. The missing questions created safe spaces where answers could never be forced. And in those spaces, absence became permanent, not because it was hidden perfectly, but because no one with power truly wanted to look too closely. Power has many ways to lose focus, and distraction is one of the quietest. During the months when absence multiplied, the crown was not idle. It was busy almost aggressively, so managing consequences it had not fully anticipated. The established fact is that the arrests triggered a cascade of administrative, legal, and diplomatic problems that demanded immediate attention. Property had to be secured, revenues reassigned, clergy consulted, allies reassured. The machinery of authority groaned under its own ambition, and in that noise something subtle slipped past. Royal correspondence from the period reveals a ruler preoccupied not with pursuit, but with consolidation. Letters emphasize securing assets, maintaining order, and defending decisions against criticism. Scholars agree that the crown's priorities shifted quickly from capture to control. Once visible authority had been asserted, the quieter work of chasing those who were no longer present seemed less urgent. Power prefers tangible victories, and seized buildings made for excellent symbols. An obscure detail sharpens this picture. In several financial directives, officials are instructed to focus on stabilizing income from newly acquired properties rather than investigating discrepancies. The message is clear enough without being stated. Make what we have work. Do not ask too many questions about what we do not. Historians debate whether this reflects pragmatism or denial. Either way, it signals a turning of the gaze. Attention moved from absence to appearance. Recall the intact castles and thinned treasuries. These outcomes would have demanded explanation if the crown had been hunting people. Instead, it treated property as proof of success. Buildings could be counted. Revenues projected. Men who were missing complicated that picture. By choosing not to center the pursuit of individuals, the crown effectively rewarded disappearance. If you are not being sought, you are already halfway safe. There is a persistent scholarly argument about whether the crown underestimated the resilience of the order's network. Some historians argue that the leadership believed removing the institutional shell would dissolve the human structure automatically. Others suggest that they simply did not care. Eliminating the order as a political entity may have mattered more than accounting for every former member. From this perspective, disappearance was acceptable collateral. A light moment fits here because institutions everywhere recognize the comfort of measurable success. It is easier to report seized assets than unresolved questions. Even today, dashboards prefer numbers that go up to mysteries that linger. Medieval governance, it seems, shared this preference. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a royal chamber cluttered with petitions, maps, and ledgers. Advisors speak over one another. Decisions pile up. Somewhere, someone mentions missing individuals. The comment is noted, then buried under more urgent matters. Fires burn low as the night stretches on. Focus narrows. The crown looks where it can act quickly. Think back to the trials that never asked about logistics. This distraction explains that choice. Investigators took their cues from the top. If leadership emphasized doctrinal guilt and asset seizure, that is where energy flowed. Asking where people had gone would lead outward beyond control. Asking what they believed led inward where authority could dominate the narrative. There is an open question that continues to divide scholars. Did the crown realize even dimly that pursuit would expose the limits of its reach? Some argue that acknowledging widespread absence would undermine claims of decisive action. Others suggest that officials genuinely believed time would solve the problem, that displaced individuals would eventually surface or fade into irrelevance. The record offers hints of both attitudes without confirming either fully. Another obscure detail invites scrutiny. In later years, royal documents occasionally reference former members as a generalized category without urgency or specificity. The phrasing suggests resignation. The problem had been reframed. Instead of fugitives, these men became remnants. Remnants can be ignored. A gentle joke earns its place. Looking elsewhere is an ancient strategy. If you cannot easily fix something, reclassify it as solved. Medieval crowns were no less skilled at this maneuver than modern administrations. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern tightens once more. Delay created time. Warnings created readiness. Silence protected intent. Geography absorbed movement, and distraction sealed the outcome. When authority turned its attention away, absence solidified into permanence. The months when movement went unseen were aided not only by careful planning, but by crowded agendas. Power does not watch everything equally. It watches what reinforces itself. By focusing on symbols of control, the crown allowed the less visible story to conclude quietly. In the end, disappearance did not require perfect secrecy. It required something far more reliable. It required that those in charge have other things on their minds. And they did. While ledgers were balanced and castles counted the people who no longer belonged to those spaces, learned that being overlooked can be the most durable form of protection. Paper has a way of telling on itself, especially when dates do not behave as expected. One of the most persistent curiosities in the record is the appearance of documents created after people were supposedly gone. Charters, inventories, acknowledgements, and confirmations continue to surface, bearing dates that fall weeks, sometimes months, beyond the moment authority claimed full control. This is an established fact, recognized by archivists who have spent lifetimes sorting ink and parchment into plausible order. The problem is not that documents exist. The problem is when they exist. At first, the explanation seems simple. Medieval dating could be sloppy. Scribes made mistakes. Documents were copied later and backdated to appear continuous. All true. Yet when these late documents cluster around specific properties and regions already noted for delayed arrests, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Scholars debate whether this reflects administrative inertia or something more intentional. Were these papers remnants of a system winding down or evidence that the system was still quietly operating? An obscure detail sharpens the question. Some documents refer to routine activities, rent confirmations, minor repairs, acknowledgments of receipt that would make little sense if the organization had already collapsed. These are not emergency measures, they are mundane, and mundanity in this context is unsettling. It suggests that someone still believed normal operations mattered at least enough to record them. The debate turns on interpretation. Were these clerks acting on habit alone, or were they responding to living instructions from people who had not truly disappeared? Recall the intact castles and the careful preservation of institutional shells. Late documents fit that same aesthetic of continuity. They smooth the transition, making the change in ownership appear orderly rather than abrupt. Authority prefers clean handovers. If paperwork extends the illusion of stability, it serves both sides. The Crown receives a narrative of control. The departing organization buys time and calm. There is a persistent scholarly argument about whether such documents indicate deception. Some historians insist they are administrative noise, the last echoes of a collapsing bureaucracy. Others argue that collapse rarely produces this level of consistency. When institutions fall, suddenly records fragment. When they wind down, deliberately records taper. The late documents look less like fragments and more like tapering, which is why the argument refuses to settle. A light moment fits here because paperwork has always had a life of its own. Anyone who has received an automated email weeks after closing an account understands the phenomenon. The system keeps talking even after the user has left. Medieval systems were slower, but the principle remains. The question is whether anyone was still listening. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a scribe at a desk long after the hall has grown quiet. He sharpens a quill, writes carefully, dates the page, and seals it. The act feels normal, necessary. No one bursts in to stop him. The world outside may have changed, but at this desk routine holds. That routine, preserved in archives, now raises questions its author never anticipated. Think back to the trials that avoided logistics. Late documents would have complicated that narrative. If operations continued even in appearance, then the story of sudden collapse weakens. It becomes harder to argue that authority arrived just in time to catch wrongdoing in the act. Instead, it suggests authority arrived after much of the real work had already been quietly concluded. There is an open question that continues to trouble scholars. Did these documents serve as signals to those still connected, indicating that it was safe to remain calm? Or were they simply the final inertia of a system that could not stop itself immediately? The answer matters because it touches intent. Signals imply coordination. Inertia implies confusion. The documents themselves do not choose a side. Another obscure detail invites scrutiny. In some cases, later authorities honored these late documents, using them to justify decisions or transfers. Scholars debate whether this reflects ignorance of the dating issue or acceptance of convenience. Invalidating paperwork creates chaos. Accepting it preserves order. Institutions tend to choose order even when it rests on questionable foundations. A gentle joke earns its place. Paperwork, it seems, is immortal. Empires fall, but forms persist. Medieval administration understood this long before modern offices perfected it. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern tightens again. Delays created space. Silence protected intent. Movement dissolved into geography. Distraction allowed absence to harden, and paperwork arriving just late enough smoothed the edges so no one felt compelled to look too closely. The late documents did not move people. They distracted from their absence. The months when movement went unseen were also months when time itself became flexible. Dates bent, records stretched. Continuity was performed on parchment even as reality shifted elsewhere. Those who had already left did not need documents to guide them. Documents were for those who remained, for those who needed reassurance that the world still made sense. In the end, paper did what it always does best. It told a story neat enough to be believed, even if it arrived after the truth had already moved on. And in that neatness, disappearance found one more layer of cover, thin but effective, pressed flat and filed away. By the time authority finished counting, the numbers refused to behave. Expectations had been high, not unreasonably so. The order had functioned as a financial engine for generations, and engines leave residue. Yet when chests were opened and columns added, the totals felt thin. This is an established fact, reflected in complaints and revisions that ripple through official correspondence. The wealth was not gone entirely, but it was not where it was supposed to be, and that discrepancy became harder to ignore as months passed. The obvious explanations arrived first. Losses during transition, poor record-keeping, exaggerated expectations fueled by rumor. All of these appear in scholarly defenses of the Crown's accounting. Yet, an obscure detail complicates the comfort of those answers. In several places, assets that should have been seized earlier appear to have been pledged, reassigned, or settled shortly before intervention. The timing is awkward. It suggests activity at precisely the moment when activity was supposed to be impossible. Recall the earlier observation that money does not always travel as coin. Obligations move more quietly. Debts forgiven or reassigned vanish without spectacle. Promissory arrangements dissolve with a word. Medieval finance thrived on trust networks that could be activated or deactivated without paperwork. Scholars argue over whether the thinning of treasuries reflects deliberate liquidation or the natural unraveling of complex arrangements under pressure. The problem is not choosing an answer. The problem is that both answers fit the evidence too well. There is an ongoing debate about whether empty treasuries indicate a final act of coordination. Some historians argue that dispersing value would protect it from seizure while preserving future influence. Others caution that fragmentation risks permanent loss, something no prudent administrator would choose. The debate turns on assumptions about intent and foresight. Did those managing assets believe there would be a future in which those assets mattered? Or were they simply ensuring that value did not fall into hostile hands, regardless of what came next? A light moment slips in here because disappointment has a sound. It is the quiet scrape of a lid closing too soon. Officials expecting abundance found explanations instead. Anyone who has ever opened a savings account statement and wondered where the balance went understands the feeling. Numbers can vanish without drama, and that mundanity makes them infuriating. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a stone chamber cool and echoing. A chest is opened. Coins glint, but not enough of them. A clerk counts twice, then once more, as if repetition might summon abundance. It does not. The room absorbs the silence that follows. Somewhere else, the value that once lived here has already changed form. Think back to intact castles and late documents. The shell of wealth remained visible while its substance had thinned. This pattern suggests not theft, but transition. Assets that cannot be carried easily remain behind. Assets that can transform quietly do so. Money is remarkably good at becoming something else when it needs to be. There is another obscure detail that keeps historians awake. In later years, disputes arise over claims that seem to reference obligations originating before the arrests. The language is cautious, indirect, but familiar. Scholars debate whether these are echoes of earlier arrangements or unrelated coincidences. The timing invites suspicion without granting proof. As always, the archive gives just enough to provoke argument and not enough to end it. A gentle joke earns its place. If you have ever tried to reconcile an account after several people helped manage it, you know how quickly clarity evaporates. Medieval accounting had fewer spreadsheets, but it suffered the same human problem. Everyone remembers doing the right thing. The ledger remains unconvinced. The empty treasuries also expose a deeper truth about the Crown's strategy. By prioritizing property over people, authority secured visible wealth while missing invisible value. Influence relationships and credit do not sit patiently in chests. They follow individuals. Once individuals were no longer present, the Crown inherited buildings and obligations, but lost the living network that made those assets productive. There is an open question that lingers stubbornly. Did the thinning of wealth occur because of deliberate planning, or because complex systems collapse quietly when stressed? Some scholars argue that even without intention, networks adapt to survive. Others insist adaptation implies agency. The debate persists because the outcome looks intelligent, whether or not intelligence guided it. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern sharpens once more. Time was used. Silence was maintained. Movement dispersed. Documents smoothed transitions. And wealth stripped of spectacle became harder to grasp. The puzzle of empty treasuries is not about missing coin alone. It is about missing leverage. The months when movement went unseen were also months when value learned to hide in plain structures, not under floors or behind walls, but within relationships that could not be seized by decree. When authority finally took stock, it found that it owned much and controlled little. The numbers told a story of success. The gaps between them told a different one, softer, but more enduring. At some point, disappearance stops being about distance and becomes about identity. The established fact is that in the decades following the arrests, records begin to show men whose backgrounds are curiously incomplete. They appear in clerical roles, in administrative posts, in rural estates, carrying experience that seems learned elsewhere but documented nowhere. Their names are ordinary. Their origins are not. For historians, these quiet arrivals raise a question that refuses to fade. Who were these men before they became so easy to overlook? Medieval society did not require identity papers in the modern sense. Names shifted easily. Surnames were flexible. Occupations could replace origins as defining features. An obscure detail complicates matters further. In several regions, individuals appear whose handwriting, legal phrasing, or financial competence mirrors that found in earlier institutional records. Scholars debate whether this resemblance indicates continuity of training or coincidence shaped by shared education. The archive offers similarity without confirmation, which is its favorite trick. Recall the earlier pattern of silence maintained during interrogations. Silence protects more than plans. It protects futures. A man who avoids confessing preparation also avoids explaining what comes next. When identity is not fixed to a condemned institution, it becomes adaptable. The disappearance in this sense was not just physical, it was narrative. Lives were rewritten quietly, one parish, one office, one household at a time. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these transitions were intentional strategies or natural consequences of displacement. Some historians argue that individuals trained in administration would inevitably find similar work elsewhere. Others insist that the clustering of such figures in certain regions suggests more than chance. Training does not disperse evenly. It follows opportunity. And opportunity in these months followed discretion. A light moment fits here because names have always been negotiable. Anyone who has ever shortened, translated, or adjusted their name to fit a new environment understands the instinct. Medieval Europe, with its fluid naming conventions, made such adjustments remarkably easy. Becoming someone slightly different required little more than not correcting people. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a man standing in a small parish office, quill in hand, signing a name that feels new but not unfamiliar. The letters flow smoothly. He has done this before, just not under this name. No one questions it. Why would they? Competence draws less scrutiny than mystery. Think back to the safe houses and the preference for proximity over exile. Changing names allowed men to remain within landscapes they understood while stepping outside the shadow of their former affiliation. Exile attracts attention. Familiarity repackaged dissolves into routine. A man who works well and speaks little becomes part of the furniture. There is an obscure detail that continues to provoke argument. In some cases, later, legal disputes reference individuals whose testimony reveals deep knowledge of institutional practices that should have been inaccessible to outsiders. Scholars debate whether this knowledge was learned secondhand or lived firsthand. The distinction matters. Learned knowledge spreads slowly. Lived knowledge appears suddenly and with confidence. The record once again refuses to clarify. A gentle joke earns its place. Reinvention has always been easier when nobody asks follow-up questions. Medieval bureaucracy, like its modern counterpart, preferred answers that worked over stories that complicated things. The open question remains difficult to resolve. Did the order dissolve into anonymity, or did its members simply shed a visible label? Survival does not require secrecy forever. It requires secrecy long enough. Once the moment passed, blending became easier. Time itself assisted the transformation. Memories softened, urgency faded, names settled into place. As this realization settles, the broader pattern tightens again. Movement slowed into settlement. Silence extended into routine. Absence became background. The men who changed names did not announce survival. They practiced it, and practice repeated quietly becomes habit. The months when movement went unseen did not end with escape. They ended with continuation under different headings. Not a dramatic rebirth, but a gentle redirection. Lives resumed without banners or oaths, carrying skills forward while leaving explanations behind. History often searches for endings, but survival rarely offers them. It prefers transitions. A man disappears from one ledger and appears in another, unchanged in substance, altered in label. And in that small administrative shift, one of the quietest victories of these months took hold, lasting long after the storm itself had passed. When these fragments are laid side by side, something subtle begins to emerge. Not a map with arrows and destinations, but a rhythm that repeats across regions that never coordinated officially. This is the established fact that draws many historians into uneasy agreement. Delays, absences, and quiet continuities appear in multiple kingdoms under different rulers governed by different laws. The similarities are not perfect, but they are consistent enough to invite comparison. And comparison, once begun, is hard to stop. An obscure detail sharpens this recognition. In regions separated by borders and language, the same kinds of gaps appear in the record. Arrests arrive late. Houses are found intact. Lists of people feel incomplete. Financial expectations fall short. These are not isolated anomalies. They cluster in time even when geography insists they should not. Scholars debate whether this clustering reflects shared conditions or shared responses. Was this simply how institutions behaved under stress? Or does the repetition imply something learned and applied across distance? Recall the earlier emphasis on couriers and implication. If guidance traveled without explicit instruction, it would leave precisely this kind of pattern. Not uniform action, but recognizable choices made under similar pressures. Borders slow armies. They do not slow ideas, especially when those ideas arrive quietly carried by people who already know where to look and when to speak. A light moment fits here because patterns often hide in plain sight. Anyone who has noticed the same workaround appearing independently in different offices understands how quickly habits spread without memos. Medieval Europe was no different. Solutions to shared problems tend to rhyme even when they are not copied directly. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture officials in different towns, opening similar reports weeks apart, each feeling vaguely dissatisfied in the same way. Something is missing. Something does not add up. Yet each assumes the problem is local, a quirk of circumstance. No one compares notes broadly enough to see the larger design. Authority remains fragmented. Absence benefits. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these cross-border similarities point to a surviving network or merely to shared training and institutional culture. Some historians argue that a network requires communication, which would leave traces. Others counter that culture itself can function as communication guiding behavior long after formal structures dissolve. The debate remains unresolved because both explanations fit the evidence uncomfortably well. Think back to the late documents that smoothed transitions and the Crown's willingness to look elsewhere. Those behaviors were not unique to one court. They appear in different administrations, responding in strikingly similar ways. When faced with complexity, power simplifies. When faced with absence, it reclassifies. These instincts transcend borders. An obscure detail worth noting appears in later diplomatic correspondence. References to former members surface occasionally framed as curiosities rather than threats. Scholars debate whether this tone reflects genuine ignorance or strategic indifference. Either way, it suggests that disappearance had succeeded at scale. Once something feels normal everywhere, it stops feeling urgent anywhere. A gentle joke earns its place. If you want to hide something, effectively distribute it widely and quietly. Centralized problems attract centralized solutions. Distributed ones dissolve into management fatigue. The open question persists. Does recognizing a pattern across borders prove coordination, or does it simply reveal how similarly people behave when faced with the same incentives? Historians continue to argue, and likely always will. The evidence refuses to collapse into certainty. It stretches just far enough to sustain debate. As this understanding settles, the narrative shifts slightly. The story is no longer about individual escapes or local delays. It is about an environment that rewarded invisibility and punished spectacle. In that environment, similar choices emerged naturally, whether or not anyone orchestrated them. The months when movement went unseen were not confined to one kingdom or one policy failure. They unfolded across a continent, fragmented by law, but united by habit. Absence crossed borders more easily than authority ever could. And once it did, it ceased to look like defiance and began to look like normal variation. Patterns do not shout. They whisper. They require patience to hear and humility to admit. When you step back far enough to see them, the silence that once felt empty now feels structured. Not designed in detail, perhaps, but shaped by shared understanding. Across borders, across languages, across jurisdictions, the same quiet story repeats. People moved when they could. They stayed when it was safe. They blended when it was wise. And authority, divided by its own boundaries, never quite realized it was watching the same disappearance happen again and again, just far enough apart to avoid recognition. With patterns finally visible across distance, attention turns inevitably to time. Not the dramatic day of arrests that history prefers to underline, but the quieter stretch that surrounded it. The established fact is that the most significant gaps, absences, and inconsistencies cluster within a surprisingly narrow window. They do not sprawl across years. They gather within months. And once you notice that compression, the story changes shape. Scholars who chart arrest dates, property seizures, and document trails find that irregularities spike in the same period, regardless of region. Before this window, routines hold. After it, outcomes harden. But during it, things are fluid. Officials hesitate. Houses empty. Accounts thin. Movement occurs that leaves no footprint. The debate does not center on whether this window exists. It centers on what to call it. Was it chaos opportunity or something closer to deliberate timing? An obscure detail sharpens the focus further. In several places, arrests technically occurred, but enforcement lagged behind announcement. Notices were read. Orders were acknowledged. Yet action drifted. Scholars argue over whether this reflects bureaucratic drag or intentional spacing. The effect, however, is consistent. The moment authority declared its intention did not coincide with the moment it exercised control. Between those two moments lies the period that matters most. Recall the earlier observations about news traveling faster than commands. That imbalance explains why timing became everything. Once warning circulated, the goal was no longer escape in a single rush, but adjustment over days and weeks. People left gradually. Assets shifted quietly. Identity softened. Each small act taken alone seemed unremarkable. Taken together, they formed a coordinated withdrawal that did not look like one. A light moment fits here because timing always looks obvious in retrospect. Anyone who has ever left a crowded place just before it became unbearable knows the satisfaction. You did nothing dramatic. You simply left at the right moment. Medieval actors understood this instinctively. They did not wait for confirmation that danger had fully arrived. They moved when probability tipped, not when certainty arrived. Sensory imagination helps again. Picture a calendar page turning slowly. Market days pass. Letters arrive and are answered. Nothing feels urgent yet. And then almost imperceptibly, priorities shift. People stop planning long-term repairs. Accounts are settled early. Farewells happen quietly. The environment changes before anyone announces it has changed. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether this window could have been predicted accurately. Some argue that no one could have known how enforcement would unfold. Others counter that experience with authority provided reliable expectations. Central power always radiates outward unevenly. Those who had watched it before could estimate its reach and pace. The debate remains unresolved, but the behavior suggests confidence rather than guesswork. Think back to the intact castles and late documents. Both make sense when placed inside this window. Castles were preserved because departure was not panicked. Documents extended normalcy because normalcy had not yet been officially revoked. The months mattered because they allowed preparation without provoking suspicion. After that, the door closed. Another obscure detail invites attention. In regions where arrests came earliest, fewer irregularities appear. In regions where they came later, the gaps widen. Scholars debate whether this correlation proves causation or coincidence. Yet even coincidence, when repeated, becomes persuasive. Time, it seems, was the variable that mattered most. A gentle joke earns its place. Bureaucracy, like weather, gives warnings before storms. People who watch carefully carry umbrellas. People who wait for rain get soaked. Medieval actors were not immune to this wisdom. As this realization settles, the narrative tightens once more. The story is no longer about whether movement happened. It is about when it happened. The months that mattered most were not defined by violence or spectacle, but by anticipation. They were months when the future was still negotiable. Once authority fully arrived, movement slowed. Once attention sharpened, silence became harder to maintain. But during that narrow window, absence could be achieved without pursuit. People left before they were hunted. Value shifted before it was seized. Identity softened before it was questioned. The months when movement went unseen were not accidental gaps in the record. They were the product of timing understood and exploited. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but effectively enough to change outcomes. History prefers dates because they are clean. But life happens in intervals. And in this case, the interval mattered more than the day. It was the space between intention and execution that allowed everything else to occur. Once that space closed, the opportunity vanished with it. By narrowing our focus to these months, the mystery becomes less abstract. It becomes human. People saw what was coming. They understood how long it would take. And they moved not dramatically, but decisively, while the world still believed it had time. For all the quiet success of departure, not everything followed. Some things stayed behind, not by accident, but by decision. This is an established fact, visible in inventories that list objects too heavy, too conspicuous, or too embedded in place to justify removal. Large agricultural equipment remained where it stood. Fixed altars stayed dressed. Stone-bound infrastructure by its nature refused to travel. What matters is not that these things were left, but that they were left consistently. The obscure detail that complicates this picture lies in what was not left. Items that carried personal meaning or institutional vulnerability vanished with remarkable selectivity. Seals, personal papers, portable reliquaries, and tools of administration tended to go. Objects that announced presence but carried little risk stayed. Scholars debate whether this selectivity reflects last-minute triage or long-practiced discipline. The pattern suggests the latter. Panic abandons randomly. Planning abandons intelligently. Recall the intact castles and the thinning of treasuries. Leaving behind what could not move served a double purpose. It reduced suspicion and accelerated acceptance. Authority arriving to find familiar fixtures intact assumed continuity even when people were absent. What cannot be moved becomes a decoy for what already has. Stone persuades where silence cannot. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether abandoning certain objects weakened any chance of return. Some historians argue that leaving behind fixed resources implies a clean break. Others counter that fixed resources are easiest to reclaim once pressure fades. The debate turns on assumptions about future intention. Did those leaving imagine a world in which they would come back openly, or one in which they would never return at all? The evidence supports both readings uncomfortably well. A light moment fits here because every move involves choices you later question. Anyone who has relocated knows the ritual of standing in a room deciding what is worth carrying. Medieval actors faced the same calculus just with higher stakes and heavier furniture. If something could not be justified quickly, it stayed. And staying in this context was not failure. It was strategy. Sensory imagination grounds this again. Picture a quiet chapel at dawn. Candles remain. Stone echoes softly. Nothing has been smashed or stripped. The space looks ready for use, as if its caretakers might return any moment. That readiness is the point. Disorder invites questions. Order answers them prematurely. Think back to the late documents and the Crown's willingness to look elsewhere. Leaving behind stable functional environments reduced the incentive to investigate further. If nothing appeared broken, nothing appeared urgent. Authority prefers to fix what looks damaged. What looks intact is assumed to be resolved. Another obscure detail invites scrutiny. In some places later, occupants repurposed these sites with minimal alteration, suggesting that the transition was smoother than expected. Scholars debate whether this ease reflects good fortune or careful preparation. Smooth handovers require fewer explanations. Fewer explanations reduce curiosity. Curiosity, as we have seen, is the enemy of disappearance. There is an open question that persists. Did the order deliberately sacrifice certain assets to protect others, or did the limits of movement simply force acceptance? The distinction matters. Sacrifice implies choice. Acceptance implies constraint. Yet in practice, the line between them blurs. Constraints shape choices until they feel intentional. The record cannot tell us where one ends and the other begins. A gentle joke earns its place. Moving teaches humility. You always think you will take more than you do. In the end, what remains behind often tells the truest story of your priorities. As this understanding settles, the broader pattern sharpens again. Movement succeeded not because everything moved, but because enough did. What stayed behind anchored appearances. What left carried continuity. The visible shell remained to reassure observers. The invisible core relocated to survive. The months when movement went unseen depended on this balance. Too much removal would attract attention. Too little would risk exposure. The solution lay in knowing what mattered most and letting the rest become evidence of normalcy. Stone walls could tell a convincing lie simply by standing still. There is a final, quieter implication here. What cannot be moved also cannot testify. Objects do not explain why they were left. They invite interpretation, and interpretation often favors the least disruptive explanation. Authority saw intact spaces and assumed closure. It did not imagine deliberate restraint. By leaving behind what was heavy fixed and visible, those who departed lightened their path without darkening the scene. The world they left looked complete enough to discourage pursuit. And that completeness paradoxically depended on absence. In the end, disappearance is not about erasing everything. It is about choosing carefully what remains. The objects that could not be moved did their job well. They stood quietly, convincing enough to let the truly important things pass beyond reach. When all the fragments are finally laid out, the shape of what happened becomes clearer, not as a dramatic escape, but as a sequence of small, disciplined decisions that reinforced one another. This is not speculation layered on romance. It is reconstruction based on established patterns that recur too consistently to ignore. The order did not flee. It thinned. It did not vanish in a moment. It repositioned over time using the very habits that once made it efficient. The operation, if we can call it that, without imagining secret rooms and shouted commands, began with awareness rather than alarm. News moved ahead of authority carried by rumor, observation, and trusted voices. That awareness did not trigger panic. It triggered restraint. Houses stopped planning far ahead. Finances grew cautious. Personal items quietly detached from fixed spaces. Nothing dramatic happened yet, which is precisely why it worked. Delay played its part next. Orders traveled slowly, unevenly filtered through layers of caution and procedure. In that delay, calendars became tools. Days were counted not toward confrontation, but toward absence. Departure did not require everyone to leave at once. It required enough people to leave early that later absences would feel unremarkable. By the time authority arrived expecting bodies, it found rooms. Movement followed the margins. Roads were avoided. Rivers were favored. Ports absorbed travelers who looked like everyone else already in motion. No surge announced intent. Dispersion replaced concentration. Each departure taken alone was forgettable. Together they hollowed out presence without drawing pursuit. This is a method historians recognize in hindsight, but rarely see while it unfolds. Silence reinforced everything. No written orders survive because none were needed. Expectation replaced instruction. Those questioned later did not need to lie about preparation, because preparation had not been named. It had been understood. Silence was not imposed suddenly. It was practiced over years of discipline and habit. When pressure came, restraint was already familiar. Shelter completed the process. Movement slowed into placement. Safe houses absorbed individuals without transforming them into fugitives. Names softened, roles adjusted. Identity became flexible rather than fixed. A man no longer affiliated officially could exist almost anywhere without explanation. Authority focused on institutions rather than individuals rarely followed. All the while, appearances were managed with care. Castles remained intact. Fixed objects stayed where they belonged. Documents extended normalcy just long enough to discourage curiosity. Authority arrived to find order rather than damage continuity rather than chaos. Satisfied, it turned to consolidation instead of pursuit. Attention moved elsewhere, and absence hardened into fact. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether this reconstruction implies deliberate coordination or emergent behavior shaped by shared training. Some argue that no central hand is necessary to explain outcomes that arise naturally from institutional culture under threat. Others insist that the compression of timing and consistency of choices imply guidance. The truth likely sits between these positions. Guidance may have existed without rigidity. Culture may have functioned as command. A light moment fits here because reconstruction often feels less impressive than legend. No secret signal fires, no midnight council, just people reading the situation correctly and acting before they were forced to. Anyone who has ever left a gathering just before it soured understands the instinct. You do not announce it. You simply go. Sensory imagination brings the reconstruction to life. Picture a series of ordinary days, a letter read more carefully than usual, a journey taken a week earlier than planned, a ledger closed with a sense of finality, a room swept and left ready. None of these actions announces itself, yet together they create a result that feels almost uncanny in retrospect. Think back to the months that mattered most. This reconstruction only works within that narrow window. Too early and suspicion would rise. Too late and pursuit would follow. Timing was not perfect everywhere, but it was good enough often enough. That is the mark of an operation shaped by probability rather than certainty. There is an uncomfortable implication that historians continue to wrestle with. If this invisible operation succeeded, it did so not by defying authority, but by understanding it. Authority moves slowly. It prefers symbols to subtleties. It counts what can be counted and trusts what looks stable. Those who moved understood this and adjusted accordingly. Invisibility in this sense was not resistance. It was adaptation. A gentle joke earns its place. The most effective operations are the ones no one believes happened, because they looked like nothing at all. Medieval actors, it seems, understood the power of boredom. As the reconstruction settles, the mystery resolves without spectacle. There is no single escape route to point to no hidden cache, to uncover no final revelation that breaks the silence. Instead, there is a method revealed only by patience. Awareness, delay, dispersion, silence, shelter, appearance, distraction. The months when movement went unseen were not an accident of history. They were an opportunity created by how power works and seized by those who understood it. The operation succeeded because it never announced itself as one, and by the time anyone thought to ask how it had happened, the answer had already scattered into routines, names, and places too ordinary to chase. Now the pace softens. The sharp edges of inquiry round off, and the story exhales. What remains is not a dramatic conclusion, but a quiet understanding that settles slowly like dust in lamplight. The months you have followed were not loud enough to demand memory. They passed without banners, without battles, without a single moment that begged to be carved into stone. And that perhaps was their greatest strength. Silence in this final light no longer feels empty. It feels intentional. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of restraint. The kind that knows when not to speak, when not to be present, when not to leave marks behind. Survival did not arrive wrapped in heroism or tragedy. It arrived disguised as routine, as waiting, as leaving early quietly and just far enough. Picture those months again, but now without urgency. Letters arriving, roads filling and emptying, harbors breathing in and out with the tide, buildings standing patiently doing their work of reassuring anyone who passed by. Somewhere nearby lives adjusted their pace. Names softened, roles changed. Nothing snapped. Everything bent. What endures is not a hidden treasure or a secret order waiting in the wings. What endures is a lesson about how history often misunderstands its own blind spots. It looks for noise. It looks for rupture. And when it finds neither, it assumes nothing happened. But something did happen here, and it happened gently enough to be missed. As your thoughts slow, consider how many stories end this way. Not with collapse, but with continuation under different forms. Not with certainty, but with patterns that feel true even when they cannot be proven absolutely. The past does not always leave answers. Sometimes it leaves habits. Sometimes it leaves absences that persist so naturally they stop feeling strange. The order did not survive as it was, that much is clear. But survival is not always about preserving shape. Sometimes it is about preserving motion. The ability to keep going, to blend into new rhythms, to accept that being unseen can be safer than being remembered. Silence, once a tactic, became a condition. And in that condition, life found ways to continue. Let the questions rest now. They do not need to be solved tonight. The mystery has done its work by showing you where to look differently. In the spaces between dates. In the delays between decisions. In the calm where panic was expected. As the fire burns low and the night stretches comfortably on, allow the story to fade without a final answer. Some histories are not meant to conclude. They are meant to drift like footsteps that lead away without echo. You can let them go now. The months have passed. The silence has settled. And whatever moved without being seen has long since become part of the background, indistinguishable from everything else that quietly survives.